the last thing that I said before I got cut off.
Psycholinguistics,
Can you
nature of
elaborate
brain
it
which allows us to use language.
Um, I didn't get that. Yeah, psycholinguistics. Okay, so um, yeah, this is one of the first things that we'll be looking at, because it will tell us you know how and how we comprehend language, how we produce language, and what are the processes involved in both the comprehension, production, and understanding. Comprehension and production of language. Okay. So I have a small presentation on psycholinguistics. Let me just share that screen. Um, I haven't used this in a while, so I have to learn how to share screens once more. Okay, I hope you can see this introduction to psycholinguistics. So this is the syllabus that we will be covering uh, in this section on psycholinguistics. So we'll be looking at the definition and scope of psycholinguistics. After that, we'll be looking at the process of child language acquisition, that is how children acquire language. Then we'll be looking at what innateness hypothesis is. After that, we'll move on to speech production and recognition. And we'll also be looking at certain speech errors, which are called aphasia. Various kinds of aphasia are there. And also we'll be looking at some other speech errors called slips and gaps. Okay, so this is basically what we have to cover in this section. So coming to psycholinguistics, we will be looking at the definition of psycholinguistics. We'll also be looking at the various branches of linguistics in general, and where psycholinguistics as a discipline is located in the general scheme of what linguistics is. And then we'll be looking at some ideas related to language processing, language acquisition, and specifically we'll be looking at uh, an area of study called neurolinguistics, which looks at how the actual structure of the brain is related to language use. So how do we define psycholinguistics, right? So from the term itself, psycholinguistics, we can directly understand that it is a kind of a hybrid term. It is a term, it is a portmanteau word, right? I'm sure you have heard of the term portmanteau words. These are words which are formed when two different words are put together to form one unified new word, right? Um, so here, in psycholinguistics, we have the two components, psycho and linguistics, one referring to the brain and the other one to language, right? So when we put these two things together, we can easily arrive at the definition for psycholinguistics, which is it is a scientific study of language, um, you know, uh, which studies it is a scientific study of the psychological and neurobiological factors that enable humans to acquire, produce, and comprehend language. Okay. So, this last sentence, which is given in this slide, this can be a starting definition for psycholinguistics, right? It is a scientific study of the psychological and neurobiological factors that enable humans to acquire, produce, and comprehend language. So these three things are the key focus areas of psycholinguistics. How do human beings acquire speech? How do human beings produce speech? And how do they comprehend language? Right. So when we look at linguistics as a discipline in general, we can find that it is easy to understand linguistics as being composed of mainly three focus areas or three branches, three main branches. Okay. The first branch deals with the sound system, right? The sound systems of various languages, the way that sounds are produced by human beings, what are the kind of speech organs that are involved in producing sounds, what are the variations of sounds that human beings can produce. So all this comes under the general area called phonology, right? Within phonology, there is a specific area called phonetics, which looks at the phonology of each individual language. So you have the phonetics of Malayalam, you have the phonetics of English, which is the study of the peculiar sound characteristics of each particular language. So phonology, as a branch of linguistics, deals with the sound system of the language. And then you have a second area called morphology, and it is related to another. It is related to syntax, and this is the area which looks at how words are formed in languages. You know, if you look at any language uh, in human history, we'll find that all of these languages contain words. Right? So a word is something of a fundamental unit of language. Ultimately, words are composed of sounds, but then word as a discrete unit has certain unique properties or significance in language, right? It takes a particular word to signify something, right? Only a word can evoke a certain meaningful response in a human being, right? Of course, there are certain sounds also. If you hear somebody screaming or crying out loud, or if you hear an infant crying, those kind of sounds do elicit certain responses from human beings. But uh, you know these responses are more in general in nature, right? It takes a peculiar combination of sounds put together into a word to actually convey some aspect of meaning to a human being, right? And we should remember one particular characteristic of words which we mentioned in the last class about how they are arbitrary in nature, right? Except for certain onomatopoeic words, words are normally uh, you know not directly linked to their meaning, right? So if you have a word like chalk, chalk, right? The peculiar combination of sounds that make up that word does not really have anything to do with that particular object, right? So that arbitrary nature of language is something that we should always keep in mind. How language is an arbitrary relationship between certain sound patterns and certain meanings. Okay, so morphology is the branch of linguistics which looks at how words are formed. Right? So it looks at a level of organization that is slightly above the level of sounds, right? While phonetics looks at the organization of sounds, the various individual sounds, uh, morphology looks at the combination of sounds resulting in words. Right? It also looks at the various grammatical properties of words. For example, the property of inflection. Right? Inflection is a system which is used in certain languages to convey certain grammatical ideas. Right? English is an inflected language because in English we use certain word endings to convey changes in number, gender, etc. Right? Or possession. If you have uh, apple, right? For a singular apple, we say just apple. But if you have multiple apples, we add the s sound as an inflection to the end of the main noun, and we get the plural. So inflection is just one technique of modifying words in a systematic way to give more meaning or to add on certain additional meaning to that word. So inflection is a part of morphology. And then at a level slightly higher than that of morphology, we look at syntax, which is the structure of entire sentences. Okay. So morphology and syntax together, they deal with the composition of words and the combination of words in languages. Okay. So the composition, the making, or the formation of words. Nobody makes words; they just form automatically. So the formation of words, the structure of words, and the structure of sentences. That is what we get in morphology. And then in semantics, we look at the entire study of meaning. So we look at how these abstract concepts are related to these concrete words in certain systematic ways. So in semantics, we look at meaning, and pragmatics is the practical use of language in certain social contexts to elicit certain meaningful responses. So semantics and pragmatics is the third, branch, the third main branch of linguistics. Psycholinguistics, it has certain aspects of relevance in all of these branches. Okay. So we already defined psycholinguistics as the study of neurobiological factors or physiological factors which govern the acquisition, comprehension, and production of language. So in order to understand how the brain is involved in all of these processes, we need to look at how the brain processes each of these things, right? How is the brain dealing with individual speech sounds? How is the brain dealing with the composition of words in morphology or sentences in syntax? How is the brain storing and understanding meaning? And how is the brain directing certain patterns of speech behavior in certain social contexts? So psycholinguistics is a kind of a, what do you say? It is an interdisciplinary branch of linguistics. It has relevance in all these three main aspects of linguistics. There are, linkages between psycholinguistics and phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Okay. So apart from psycholinguistics, it is a rather new area of linguistics, which has come, into being only in the last, century or so, right? Because it is only in the last century that we have had techniques and methods by which we can actually study the human brain, right? So before that, the human brain was a big mystery, right? If you look far back enough, if you look at the Greek philosophers and people like Aristotle and Plato, they thought that the brain was an organ which had a cooling function, right? The the heart pumps the blood, and the blood travels all over the body, and it gets heated up, right? So and then it goes to the brain, and the brain is something like a radiator or something, right? It cools the blood down, and then it sends it back to the heart for circulation. So that was what the ancient Greek scientists, they believed that the brain simply had a kind of a cooling function, right? So they did not realize that it is the seat of consciousness. So that realization came only much later. Okay. So so that is about yeah. So what I'm saying is psycholinguistics is a rather new branch of linguistics, along with certain other new branches of linguistics too, like computational linguistics, historical linguistics, social linguistics, and we will be looking at at least some of the important characteristics of these areas too later on in our classes. So generally, when we look at any kind of discipline, whether it is linguistics, whether it is some scientific discipline, in the last century or so, most scientific disciplines have become extremely specialized, right? So earlier on, when we thought that, a zoologist is a person who studies animals, right? But there are no longer any zoologists in the world, right? Every scientist who is working in zoology will be specialized, as a specialist who studies some animal or the other. So, in our own college, we have a dedicated center for the study of spiders, arachnology, right? So if you go to our zoology department, you will see a lab which is dedicated just for the study of spiders. And every year, our faculty members, Matthew sir, Matthew MJ sir, and his researchers, they find, at least two or three species of new spiders in the Western Ghats, right? So their entire research is focused on, just that particular animal, just spiders, right? So that level of specialization is seen in linguistics as well, right? So in the last century, we have all of our areas of knowledge have become rather specialized, and this is something that you too must realize as you are completing your MA, because in our MA classes, this is our last chance as a student to gather non-specialized knowledge, right? Here we are free to roam around, right? We are like a some sort of a grazing animal, like a sheep or a cow who is left to roam the field. We can nibble some patch of grass here, we can move on to another patch of grass there, we can taste this, we can taste that, we can see what we like. But after this level of post graduation, when we move on to MPhil or PhD, we are no longer free to roam around and taste new things. We become narrowly focused on one thing or another, and from then on, all of our writings, all of our readings will be rather tied down to that. Okay. So that is a peculiar nature of our particular time, our modern knowledge making systems. Okay. So anyway, coming back to linguistics, um, we have some branches and goals of linguistics. As I said, linguistics is interested in understanding language processing, how language is processed by the brain, how language is acquired by the brain, and also the various kinds of structures in the brain, uh, neurolinguistics, through which language is processed. Okay. So coming to the first of these ideas, language processing. By language processing, we mean the conversion of thought to speech. Okay. In the last class, I mentioned a peculiar hypothesis, uh, which stated that our thoughts may be defined by language. We may not have anything as thoughts as such, right? There is no such entity as a thought which is divorced or which is isolated or free from language. Everything may be linguistic to a certain degree. Uh, so even if we don't subscribe to that idea, if we still believe in the traditional outlook that thought and language are two different things, right? Uh, there is something fundamentally human called thought, which then gets expressed in different ways in different languages as speech. Okay, so even if we believe in that traditional approach to language, uh, we still have to look at the whole complex process by which this thought is translated into speech. And that is what language processing is all about. It is about the processes which are involved in turning a thought into speech. And language comprehension, which is the other half of language processing, is quite the opposite, or just the opposite phenomena. It is about how input speech, the speech that we perceive, the speech that we hear, is interpreted and turned into meaning or thought that we understand. So both of these two processes can be understood as two sides of the same coin, right? Production as well as thought comprehension. I mean, sorry, speech production and speech comprehension are very much related to each other. Okay, and if we look at any aspect of our human body, you know, we will not find something which is more complex than this process of speech production and speech comprehension, right? So it takes immense amount of processing, right? It takes a lot of brain power in order to comprehend and produce speech. And that is why, even though we have extremely powerful computers now, we have computers that can even predict the movements of extremely complex systems like weather, right? Weather is something which is traditionally seen as something which is almost unpredictable, because so many variables are involved, so many factors are involved. But using our complicated computer systems, we can even predict weather to a certain extent, right? Uh, but when it comes to modeling the way the language processing organs of the brain work, how is language processed, that system is far more complicated, and it is almost impossible for even our most complicated computer programs to model human speech, right? That is why you know even though we have advanced so much in artificial intelligence, we still don't have a computer which is capable of perfectly mimicking human speech production and speech comprehension, right? Now, all of us have mobile phones on which we have a lot of digital assistants, right? We can say, okay, Google, or we can say, hey, Alexa, or something like that, and our mobile phones are able to catch on to that word and respond, right? But it is not perfect, right? It is nowhere near the level of comprehension that uh, ordinary human beings are capable of, right? So that indicates how complex a process this is, comprehension and production. And then in language acquisition, which is called acquisition studies, what we'll be looking at is, um, you know, how does this process of language acquisition take place in such a limited amount of time, right? By the time a child is 3 years old, right, majority of the language acquisition process has been accomplished, right? So how is this possible within such a small amount of time, right? Because when you are learning a language, sometimes when we go to our college, we have to take a new second language. Maybe we opt to learn French or Sanskrit or something, and we quickly realize that it is very difficult, right? Learning a language does not just involve memorizing some words or phrases, right? Learning a language, is you have to learn all of the systems of the language, starting from the sound system, the way the words are put together, what are the rules governing how words are put together. Then there are more rules concerning how those words can be put together into sentences. And then you have to understand about social context, what is appropriate in certain contexts, what is not appropriate. So it is a very complex process. But a child, um, who is arguably not competent in many other things, right? A child can't even move around by itself, but still that child is able to pick up language almost as if by magic, right? It is almost as if the entire process is very automated. So How is this possible? How is it possible for a child to so easily acquire such a complicated system? Right? So that is what language acquisition looks at. This whole area looks at how that whole process takes place. Right? What are the strategies? What are the phases involved in language acquisition? And what is the quality of input? That is, uh, the child acquires language primarily through what the child hears, and based on what the child hears, the kind of language that the child acquires also differs. So sometimes, if the quality of input is low, that is, if the parents are maybe the child is born to a house where both of the parents speak different languages. One may be a person who speaks Hindi, and the other parent may be somebody who speaks Malayalam, right? So uh, what kind of language will the child acquire, right? So in such a household, when we are studying how that particular child acquires language, we have to take into account the quality of input. Is the child getting exposure in one particular language, or is it a mix of different languages? And how does the child process both of these things, right? If it is a mixture, is the child able to distinguish between words belonging to one language and acquire it independently of the words that it is exposed to from the other language? So all of these complicated questions we will deal with in language acquisition. And finally, in neurolinguistics, we will be looking at the central nervous system, which we can abbreviate as the CNS. Uh, what is the CNS? The CNS is simply the brain plus the spinal cord and all the neurons. Right? The entire nervous system. That is what the CNS stands for. It is the brain plus the spinal cord and all the various neurons that emanate from the spinal cord going through to various parts of the body. So how is this network? Right, the central uh, the central nervous system is nothing but a very elaborate network. So how is this elaborate network able to uh, you know produce these effects of language? So we'll be looking at the vocal tract, that is the various organs located in our body which help us to produce language. We'll be looking at the various brain centers, various parts of the brain where language is produced. And we'll be looking at various kinds of language disorders, especially two kinds of language disorders, two kinds of aphasia called Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia, which are two different diseases. They are um, problems which occur when people cannot speak. Right? So we'll be looking at Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia and what these diseases can tell us about language processing. Right? A lot of what we know about psycholinguistics comes from the study of these language disorders, right? Because up until very recently, there was no way that we could observe a human brain at work, right? A human brain is one of the most inaccessible organs that we have. We can look at how our hand works, or we can look at how our eye works. We can at least see, or we can look at how various muscles work. These are all more or less directly observable. But the brain is something which is tightly shut off from all other external observation. You cannot directly observe a brain when a person or an animal is living. You have to wait until that animal or a person is dead, and then you can perform some kind of a post-mortem examination of the brain. But the amount of information that we can gain from such an examination is very limited. So that leaves us with only one other choice, that is observing illnesses of the brain. Right? We can observe people after they have undergone some sort of illness, resulting in certain disorders of the brain. And from these, uh, brains, the study of brains that are not working properly, we can hypothesize, we can create certain theories about how the actual brain works. So it is a bit like, reverse engineering, right? This is a term that I'm sure we have, all very familiar with reverse engineering, especially in the context of technology, right? Whenever some big company comes up with a new smartphone or a computer or some new technology, all the other the rival companies, the competitors, they will buy this product, and then they will assign a team of engineers to reverse engineer what they have done, right? So that is what happened with Apple, right? Apple was the first company to bring out a kind of a touch mobile phone, right? And immediately after Apple, came out with this mobile phone, I think it was in 2006 or 2008 that the first iPhone came out. Immediately after that, engineers from Samsung, they reverse engineered the iPhone, and they started producing something like a copy of the iPhone. And this has led to a kind of a very long legal battle between Apple and Samsung. And ultimately, Samsung had to pay a lot of money, as compensation to Apple for taking inspiration from its phone. Yeah. So this reverse engineering is something that is very common in the tech world, right? Whenever something new comes out, we break it into various pieces and then we see how it works. So early psycholinguists also, they looked at these people suffering from various speech disorders, and from their examples from their lives, uh, the scientists were able to make certain generalized theories about how the brain works. And there is a word or a term which psycholinguists use to describe their hypothetical model for how the brain processes language. And this term is called the standard model. Okay. So psycholinguists, they have come up with this term called the standard model, which is their standard idea of how the brain works, to produce language, to comprehend language, to produce language. So we'll be looking at some aspects of the standard model, in our later classes. So today, since we are almost out of time, um, okay, let us just end this presentation, and yeah. So yeah. So when we look at language disorders in more detail, um, the first two things that we'll be looking at are these two kinds of language disorders called Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. And you know, normally these disorders arise from some sort of trauma, right? Uh, sometimes patients may hit their head somewhere as a result of some accident, and this may affect their speech. Or a more common reason is stroke, right? I'm sure all of us know what a stroke is. A stroke is what happens when there is some sort of a blood clot inside the brain, and as a result of this blood clot, some of the brain tissue does not get enough oxygen and degenerates. And this kind of a disease can affect the production of language. Okay. um, you should remember that the brain, even though the brain is very small, right? At the most, a brain can be maybe 1.5 to 2 kilograms in weight, compare that to the weight of the body. Even the lightest person among us will be like maybe 40 or 45 kilograms, right? So the brain is less than what, 2% of the mass of the body. I'm not very good at math, maybe it is more, but anyway, you get the idea. But this organ consumes 25% of the oxygen that our lungs is able to absorb from the air, right? And it consumes as much energy as a 100-volt bulb. This is also something that I read somewhere long. I'm not very sure about whether it is 100 watt or 80 watt, but you get the idea, right? It consumes a lot of energy, the brain, right? And in order to supply this energy, a constant flow of blood is necessary, right? Blood is continuously flowing through the brain, and due to that very endless flow, it is also possible for small clots to occur from time to time. And when this is very serious, it results in a stroke, what we know as a stroke. So in the late 19th century in France, there was a doctor called Paul Broca, and he observed that many of his patients who had suffered from such strokes, they were exhibiting some of the some symptoms that were all common. They were all unable to produce speech in certain common patterns, right? So after these patients, some of them did not survive. So after their deaths, Broca would observe their brains, and he noticed that all of them suffered some sort of damage to one particular area of their brain. Okay. And he hypothesized that this particular area of the brain has something to do with language, because whenever a patient suffers some sort of damage to this particular area of the brain, um, you know that patient exhibits some sort of language problems. So he called this area Broca's area. Okay, this area of the brain, Broca's area. So where is this Broca's area located? It is located in the left hemisphere of the brain. So if you touch your head somewhere, a little higher than your temple, the left side of your temple. The temple is your, the place that is slightly above your eyes. So if you touch the place somewhere slightly above your left eye to the side, right? That area of the brain inside the skull, that area of the brain is called Broca's area. So whenever patients suffer some sort of damage to this area, they exhibit Broca's, the condition called Broca's aphasia. Right? So what is Broca's aphasia like? In Broca's aphasia, the patient is able to understand speech. There is nothing wrong with comprehension. But production is severely limited. The patient is not able to produce fluent speech. Uh, Expressing individual words is very difficult. Uh, Stringing words together into meaningful sentences is even more difficult. The patient seems to have lost all grammatical abilities, right? Grammatically coherent speech is not possible. And it is all very laborious. The patient takes a long time to express something. So Broca theorized that there is some part of the brain located just above the left temple, in the left hemisphere of the brain, which is concerned with the production of language. Right? And then after a few years, I think it was in 1894 or something, a German doctor called Carl Wernicke, Wernicke, he observed that damage to another part of the brain also had similar, not similar, also had some sort of impact on language. So he observed that patients, when they suffer injury to the part of the brain just behind their ear, left ear, okay, again, this is a part of the brain just uh, behind the left ear. If language, if that part of the brain is somehow damaged, then the patients will have another kind of aphasia called Wernicke's aphasia. So in Wernicke's aphasia, speech production is not affected. Right, they can produce speech. There is nothing wrong with saying words. They can say sentences grammatically. There is no problem in expressing. But what they express will have no meaning at all. Right. So it is like, whatever they are saying very fluently things, but it doesn't have any meaning at all. Okay. So that kind of aphasia is called Wernicke's aphasia. Right. So Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. So between these two kinds of you know diseases, scientists or early neurolinguists, they were able to identify two distinct areas of the brain, right, which are somehow connected with speech. Okay. So we'll continue with our discussion on linguistics in the next class. So for today, what I'll do is I'll send you a small PDF file, one chapter from a book called, um, I think it is called The Basics of Linguistics by R.L. Trask. It's a very easy to read and interesting chapter. So that will be your reading for today. And in the next class, we'll discuss, it is concerned with psycholinguistics. And we'll discuss the ideas from that chapter. Okay. So is that clear? Did anybody, does anybody have any doubt from what I have just said? I don't even know whether you have been hearing, because I have been having certain problems with the network here. I hope I have been audible.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, then you can leave. If you don't have any doubts, you can leave, and we will meet in the next class. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.